Welcome to worship at Westminster and to our inclusive family of faith. We especially welcome our visitors and those of you joining us on YouTube.
Our third reading this morning comes from Job 19, verses 23 to 27a. Listen to Job's words. Oh, that my words were written down. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and with lead they were engraved on a rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have a confession to make to you this morning. In all my dreams of motherhood, I never thought about how mean I would have to be. In a broken and fearful world that rages with injustice and unrighteousness, my overly dramatic children suffer so. I don't know where they get it from. You see, Lee and I are so incredibly unfair. Our poor sons often feel so unjustly accused and put upon. They must do awfully hard things like unload the dishwasher, maybe even the whole thing. They have to pick up the playroom and, to everyone's shock and horror, put away their clean clothes. Sometimes, being really unfair parents that we are, we even ask them to help clean up messes they didn't make. And in good biblical tradition, like Job, they put us on trial, wondering what did they do to deserve such injustice, wondering how we could be so unfair when they are totally innocent and would never, ever, ever do anything wrong. This may just be my household. And while I'm slightly teasing my beloved children, you all know that feeling I'm talking about. When you have been done wrong, when someone else takes credit for your work, when someone abuses your trust, when everything seems to go wrong and you have a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day or week or month or year. Somehow ingrained in us that if we think if we do good, we'll get good things, and if we do bad, consequences will come our way. We're surrounded by this messaging that echoes that point of view, and it is tempting because it gives us a sense of control. If we can predict the outcomes by our actions, then we can control everything that happens to us. We can even control our faith. We can even control God. We're thinking together this fall about what it is that disciples do, how we live out our beliefs. And one question that must emerge on this journey: do we only have faith when things go right? Do we only have faith in that which we can control? What does faith look like when everything goes wrong? Exploring control and what part faith plays in our life is a central theme in the book of Job. Job was a righteous man who loved God and loved his family, and he treated people fairly. And not only was he righteous, he went to great lengths to ensure his children were right with God too, offering sacrifices after parties to wipe away any possible sin. Despite doing everything right, despite doing everything by the book, despite living by faith, he loses his livestock, then his servants, and then all of his children. It was really unfair. Why did all those bad things happen to him? Hadn't he done everything right? Hadn't he checked all the boxes? His friends sit in silence and mourning with him for 7 days. And then they try to explain that Job must have done something wrong to deserve these bad things happening. But Job refuses to concede, fighting for his innocence, righteousness, and honor, fighting for the truth. And so this morning's passage that we heard comes in response to his friends who are continuing to insist that he must have done something wrong, that he'd gotten on the wrong side of God. He responds that he's not going to stop trying to clear his name. Instead, he wants to write down his story in stone to last forever. And he boldly proclaims, "I know that my Redeemer lives." Some of us cannot hear that phrase without hearing echoes of Handel's Messiah or other beautiful contemporary music. But Job wasn't talking about Jesus, and he wasn't really even asking for God's help. For the ancient Hebrew people, the Goel, Redeemer, was a legal recourse to right wrongs. It was a kinsman redeemer who could avenge bloodshed, reclaim property, and free relatives from slavery. It's the embodiment of family solidarity. And we see this redeemer role throughout the Bible. We hear it in Jesus' teaching to the Sadducees this morning. And most notably, it's that kinsman redeemer role that Boaz takes on by marrying Ruth and providing Naomi with a grandson, continuing a family branch that eventually bears King David. So when Job cries out about his Redeemer living, he is not, in fact, praising God, but accusing God. He is effectively saying, even if you kill me, my kinsman Redeemer will live and will continue my case against you. My Redeemer will avenge me. Whew. It's a bold take, accusing the Creator of all things of not doing his job. Is that living by faith or living by doubt? Is such an accusation an act of worship or an act of faithlessness? Are we allowed to be angry with God as faithful disciples? For Job, This is indeed an act of deep faith. This accusation is a byproduct of living by faith. In the words of the Old Testament scholar and professor, Dr. Ellen Davis, Job rails against God, not as a skeptic, not as a stranger to God's justice, but precisely as a believer. It is the very depth of Job's commitment to God's ethical vision that makes his rage so fierce and that will finally compel an answer from God. For Job's faith taught him that God is supposed to be our Goel, the Redeemer of the orphan and the widow, the distressed and the downtrodden. His faith teaches him that God is the source of all goodness, that God has the power to change and transform and turn around our lives. It is faith that undergirds Job's accusations, faith in the God that delivers people from oppression, that reclaims promised land, that restores families. It's living by faith to expect a good God to take good care of God's precious people. But Job's accusation and the entirety of his story raise a large question for disciples then and now. Can we love that which we cannot control? God is not like a vending machine after all. We cannot simply put in the right codes through prayer and get our desired result. So can we still love a God we cannot control? Can we have faith in the Creator who made us but also mosquitoes? Can we trust in a God who is both the judge and the Redeemer? Can we boldly stand and proclaim with hope and anger that my Redeemer lives, that those who are unjustly accused will not suffer forever but will be vindicated, set free, and redeemed? Elie Wiesel, the noted Holocaust and survivor and powerful storyteller, wrote a play about the trial of God, based on a trial he witnessed in Auschwitz. In light of the absolute horrors the Jewish people were facing, God was accused of crimes against humanity. As with any trial, 3 rabbis acting as judges listened to witness testimony and evidence and concluded with a unanimous verdict that God was guilty of abandoning God's people. He says that there was then an infinity of silence. And one rabbi, noticing that the sun had set, called them together for evening prayer, worshiping the same God they had just convicted. For Wiesel and for Job, these acts of accusing God are not about faithlessness. Rather, it is a call to action for God, to remind God what we need and who we know God to be. Like the crying out of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, it is a prayer to rise like incense, to call God once more, to take on the role of our vindicator and our redeemer, because we cannot do it ourselves. When we strive to live by faith in today's broken, fearful, and unfair world, sometimes tragedy can shake us to the core. Everything seems to be turned upside down. But what happens to our faith? If faith is only possible when we are happy and everything is okay, then that is not the faith of our ancestors. Living by faith means trusting in God when the sun shines and when the rain pours, when the new day dawns and when the longest night seems to never end. Living in faith looks like thanking God for blessings, lamenting over griefs, pleading to set things right, angrily accusing God of abandoning God's people. Those are all valid ways that disciples live by faith in relationship with God. And Job's story, along with the depth of the Psalms and other parts in the Bible, tell us that God can handle it. God can take whatever we have to cry out, to scream, to rage, to dance, and to delight. For to control the results of our lives of faith is not living by faith. It takes out the essential component of hope. But when hope is at the center of our faith, we are welcomed into a life abundant, living in the light of Christ. Having faith does not mean that everything will always work out, or that we will never be unjustly accused, or that we will always get what we deserve. Disciples do not give up their faith when the illusion of control is revealed or when life takes a wrong turn. Disciples instead cling to their faith, holding our God and our neighbor accountable to justice and righteousness and shalom. Disciples shout into whirlwinds, reveling in the beauty and wildness of creation and our Creator. In a different tone, in a different time, in a different place, we too can say with Job, I know that my Redeemer lives. It wasn't Job's story, but the rest of our story tells us that our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, lives on past the grave. And indeed, he vindicates us, not because we are righteous, but because he is, not because we are sinless, but because he is. Jesus comes to stand in that gap between human and divine, to fully experience humanity and divinity, that he might be able to reconcile the two. And it's because we know the end of his story that we can live by faith. For we know the greatest injustice of all, that Jesus Christ was put to death on a cross as an innocent lamb led to slaughter. And rather than taking his kinsman redeemer right to avenge the bloodshed of his son, God transformed that act of violence into an act of resurrection and redemption. God, our Goel, our Redeemer, did the most unjust thing of all by using his son's life, death, and resurrection to include us in God's family. The ultimate act of redemption, restoration, and reclaiming that which belongs to God. Giving up control and letting God be God means we have the gift of new life. After Job's confrontation with God, he returned to his life not with anxiety, but with a renewed sort of joy. And not the lighthearted sort of joy, but the joy that can only come once you have known despair. The Bible tells us that Job lived 140 more years, choosing life, choosing to have more children, servants, and livestock. Something had changed. He's no longer concerned with his children's moral righteousness and is more concerned with loving them ostentatiously, offering an inheritance to not just his sons, but to his daughters as well. The Bible tells us that he died old, full of days, in Hebrew, completely satisfied. Relinquishing control, wrestling theologically with his friends, confronting God, and living by faith taught him the expansive nature of God's love and how to live that out in his own life. So may you know deep in your bones that your Redeemer lives. May you cry out to your Redeemer full of love, full of anguish, full of grief, full of gratitude. May you live by your faith in the hills and valleys of life, not because of our own might or power, but because of God's. May we give up the illusion of control and instead choose hope and ostentatious love. May we live by faith in the fullness of our days, for that's what disciples do.